for you to get some reflections on this talk published. Right, let me introduce Suzanne Schritzke. In fact, I can do better than that. Suzanne Schritzke, a colleague from, as you can see from the cover slide, the Smith School of Enterprise and the Environment in our department, or the School of Geography and the Environment, where Suzanne is one of our research associates, which means she's one of those hard-labouring workhorses who not only generate all their own funding, but do all the work on the ground. Suzanne spends 3 to 4 times a year, well, in normal years, in Zambia, where she started on-grid, and now she's become a real Africa enthusiast for off-grid electrification, started by electrifying schools, and is now doing more and more work in this area to, basically help some of those who most need electricity to get it. And as I said, this has been one of our most popular sign-ups colloquium topics this term. So I'm very excited to hand over to Suzanne and learn more about energy access and off-grid electrification in sub-Saharan Africa, challenges and opportunities. Thank you, Suzanne.
Thank you very much, Philip. Welcome everybody, and thank you for joining in. I'm really glad that you are interested in my presentation. And since you are here, you might ask yourself, or you belong to the big group of people asking themselves, why do we have these problems of electrification in Africa? Why do so few people have access to electricity in Africa? Since we have a very mixed audience, I'm trying to illustrate a bit of the bigger picture here, and then we'll also present some findings from the community level. Who are the people we're talking about and who want and need to be electrified? As I said earlier, if you have any questions in the meantime, please jump in, ask or comment. I'm more than happy to hear your feedback. I'm not sure I can see the chat, so I'm not very used to Microsoft Teams, but please jump in and feel free to ask any questions. So what are we going to talk about today? I'm trying to structure it. Some information might be new for you and some information might not be so new for those who are familiar with the topic. So I apologize if you already heard some of these facts, but I try to give you the bigger picture. So I'm going to present a bit of the projects I'm working and where all this information comes from that I'm going to present. I'm giving you a bit of the bigger picture, the background, why is energy access so low? What are the figures we're talking about? And then I would like to introduce the off-grid electrification systems. What are mini-grids? What are the solutions that might be feasible to electrify rural Africa? And then the most important part is the community ecosystem part, where we talk about community needs and demands and our findings from long work we did in Zambia and Uganda and other countries. And then we move on and ask ourselves, what does this mean for mini-grid implementation? How do we have to design solutions to be successful on the ground? And what can the policymakers do to facilitate rural electrification? And I'm happy to take questions and have a wider discussion also after the presentation. Just to give you a bit of background why I'm so enthusiastic about the topic. So I came to Zambia 14 years ago, and I've never been to Africa before. I was working for a big company, had the typical Western picture, and then I was totally amazed by the country and the people. And I went to the villages and I was shocked by the low degree of energy access and the way of life, although people are very inspiring and they're very positive. And I thought, how can we change the situation? And I've been working hard, and my ultimate goal is to find these solutions that work on the ground. And I'm more than happy, to have teams and have partners who help and share the same passion. So I'm coming from the on-grid sector, as Philip mentioned. So I was working on the scaling solar evaluation for Zambia before I turned towards off-grid. And a lot of findings I'm going to present here is from a project called RISE. So I will later show you the website. It's a project from the Smith School, and it was a joint venture between the University of Oxford, the University of Cape Town, And our basic question was from a macro level, like how can we facilitate rural electrification in Africa? What needs to be done? So as you can see in the corner, that's the team, the RISE team. Some of the colleagues are still working at the Smith School or at the University of Oxford. It was led by Aoife Brophy. You can see there in the middle. And we were a great team, very mixed team. And out of this project, which ended this year, someone needs to mute the phone. Okay, so the project ended in February, and now I'm working on a project that's called Mumuni Singani. So I'm not sure if someone joined in from Zambia or knows Tonga language. So this means light in Singani. And it's like going back to the roots. So while we explored the macro level in our project RISE, I'm now looking at the community level, and I clearly want to answer the question, like, how can we develop an infrastructure solution that is sustainable? This is where I am now. The project runs until April with all the challenges due to the COVID situation. So my field visit was very limited this year, which means zero. But I'm working with a wonderful organization called Youth Development Organization in Choma in Southern Province, who supports me incredibly during my field research. They are actually out now in the communities and trying to find answers to all of my crazy questions. And I hope I get some data back next month. So it's great when you have partners who work with you. And we hope that we can actually implement the concept we're currently developing sometime next year beyond 2021. So we have a lot of proposals in the pipeline as of now. We're waiting to talk a little bit more what we're trying to achieve. But yeah, the situation is very open at the moment, and we're in good hope that we'll achieve something in the coming years. So if we hear energy access Africa, you know, everyone has some idea what it means, and we have the general idea that it's low, but what it actually means is illustrated on the slide. So this is Kenya. So we see Nairobi and we see rural Kenya. And I want to show you that there's a big gap between rural and urban energy access. So while the majority in urban Africa has somehow access to energy, mainly grid energy, rural energy access is very low. Although I'm very well aware of energy access doesn't mean energy access if you have outages of 12, 14 hours a day, which some countries face. The general access in rural areas is much lower. We still have some discussions of how we measure energy access. Do we take in solar home system into consideration, or is it just grid? So that's an unsolved topic, but this is, let's take it for now and say, okay, rural energy access is much lower than urban. And that does not only mean that, you know, people can enjoy the advantages of having electricity in the cities. It also means that the rural-urban divide gets bigger and bigger. So people are disconnected from education and access to modern communication in rural areas. However, the picture on the continent is very mixed. So we have some countries which have made great efforts in increasing rural electrification, for example, like Ghana or South Africa. But we also have countries that still lack rural electrification and energy access in rural areas. And one example is Zambia, where we have like a rural electrification rate of 3 to 4%, which means that almost 9 million people are excluded from energy access in this country. So there are a lot of factors contributing to energy access. So it also means population density, size of the country, rural-urban divide. So there's a lot of factors contributing to these access rates. In terms of number of people, we always hear that figure 600 million people in sub-Saharan Africa don't have access to energy. If you read articles in the topic, this figure appears everywhere, which is more or less true, as you can see. But what's also stunning is to see that the number of connections and people without access does not really have changed a lot over the last decade. You know, there have been amazing efforts, and donor organizations have spent billions of dollars in supporting rural electrification. The problem is that the number of new connections at the moment grows slower than the population growth. So population is growing faster than enhancing energy access. And that's a problem. And you see here a projection from the IEA that in 2030, this number does not really have changed a lot, which means that we can't really, that we're not close, even close to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals if we continue like we're doing now. And this is a figure from December last year, so it's fairly new. Well, what does it mean if you don't have access? So we're looking here into electric power consumption. And if we talk electric power consumption, yeah, it does not only mean that you run your TV or turn the light on. It also means, what does it mean for productive use? Of course, we know the United States is a big power consumer. But if you compare this with most African countries, the energy consumption is much lower. That also means that consumption for energy, for production and economic purposes is much lower, which prohibits Africa from growing in these sectors. But what does it mean not to have access to electricity? And I said earlier, when I came to Zambia the first time, you go to the villages, and when it gets dark, it's dark. So when we think of electricity, we think of not having light at night, or maybe not being able to watch TV. But it has an impact on so many areas, and they're basically all somehow related to the SDGs. So I was talking about education. I visited these schools in rural Zambia, and most of them have computer labs because the government or some donor organizations provide them. But the school, they can hardly run it. Sometimes they have a small diesel generator or one solar panel, but it's all very unreliable. And these kids, you know, they don't even have a chance for their future education. So, as I said, rural-urban divide in this point is getting bigger and bigger if we don't act. Local businesses are really constrained in growing. So if you look at that picture, you see that businessman that's in Southern Province in Sherman. I was impressed because he was like recycling old beds, but of course he did it all by hand and he couldn't use any electrical devices, which like establishes a glass ceiling for these businesses to grow. We're talking about water supply, electric water pumps and irrigation. We're talking about farming and food security, and in conjunction with climate change, this is a big problem for many African regions. And very striking is the picture. This was also taken in Southern Province. And if you look at the causes of morbidity, you see that respiratory infections is the #1 and by far #1 cause of death. And this is caused by hazardous fuels, by using kerosene lamps indoors and cooking with open fires, which also contributes to deforestation and environmental problems. So these are all connected issues here. And if we talk about problems, we also talk about opportunities. So I have the SDGs here, and I know it's a big topic, and some people might yawn if they see them, but they are still important. And even though if we are not as to achieving SDG 7 for Africa, we should not give up. And we should also see the context here. So what if we increase access to energy, we can also increase so many other SDGs and their achievement. So we ask ourselves, why is the problem so persistent? And one answer is if we're looking at the electrical grid in sub-Saharan Africa, and that's a grid map. As you can see, there are a lot of white spots. So a lot of areas are not connected to the electrical grid. And it's not economical to ever connect them in the near future because you have a very low population density. And the investment costs are incredibly high, especially for countries who are poor and in debt. So we cannot solve rural electrification by just simply expanding the grid in the near future in many areas. And I was talking about Ghana earlier. You can see if you just compare the sheer size of Ghana and the structure of the electrical grid with other countries, for example, if we look at Angola or Congo, this is a completely different picture. And that also explains the low electrification rates, partially. This is a picture from Zambia now. So as you can see, this is a geospatial model of electrified areas, and all the yellow spots and parts are areas that have energy access that are somehow electrified, mostly urban areas, and everything else is not electrified. So there's a lot of empty space, but it doesn't mean that there are no people. So of course, it's mostly rural, it's mostly villages that are scattered around. But that doesn't mean we should simply give up and say, okay, these people don't have electricity, they will never have. So the most suitable option that's discussed at the moment are decentralized systems. So mainly mini-grid and microgrid systems. We can, you know, that the terminology is not always very stringent and very clear. So I use the term mini and microgrid in exchange because, you know, we're talking about systems between 5 kilowatt up to 100 kilowatt in reality. And there are different uses and appliances connected to these systems. So you see on these 4 pictures, you see a home-based system, which is very, very common in rural areas. It's basically 1 or 2 solar panels and you just connect a device to that. You see a solar hammer mill. It's a 12 kilowatt peak, I think, system in rural Zambia, but that only powers the hammer mill. So that's a productive-based system. And then we have a community-based system, which is a clinic. Sometimes these clinics also power the surrounding houses. And then you have a mini-grid system, which powers houses and businesses that are around it with 100 to 300 connections, depending on the size. So these are the main off-grid systems that are currently in use and seen as the future for rural electrification in Africa. As I said, the use of these systems, or the energy output and the energy use of these systems, is very different. If we have the solar home systems or standalone systems, often the energy output is very low, especially with solar home systems, and they hardly allow any productive use, where with microgrid systems, you are allowed, they allow a more diversified use of energy, like for private households and businesses. However, as interesting these systems look, we have a lot of white elephants. So the main question at the moment is, how can we make these systems sustainable, and how can we develop sustainable energy solutions? I have this picture here. That's the mini grid in Panta. That was is the first Zambian mini grid. Was implemented with a huge donor contribution, but it's not running very smoothly, to say at least. So we have very low number of customers, a lot of outages due to various reasons, and despite the high OPEX, the high CAPEX, sorry, of around $21 per watt installed, we have an annual OPEX deficit of around $20,000, which are currently covered by the Rural Electrification Authority in Zambia. So, of course, we want to avoid these systems. As part of my research, I'm currently running an analysis of the sustainability of mini grids, and I don't want to be negative here, but there's a general lack of data, so we hardly find case studies that provide detailed CAPEX and OPEX data for the mini grid studied. And the ones that do, well, it's hard to find any mini grid that runs sustainably in their operations. I haven't found one yet. So if you operate or you build or you know a mini grid that's completely sustainable, please email me. I would be very happy to hear about it. I don't want to paint a black picture, but this also offers an opportunity for us to say, okay, how can we find a solution that isn't a white elephant, that doesn't cost a lot of money, and that achieves the goal that we want to achieve when we're developing these systems. Do you have any questions so far?
Yes, one just popped in from John Park, just on this point, how customers pay for their electricity.
That's a very good question. It's actually the central question I want to discuss here. Do you mean with this mini grid, or in general? Is this a general question or referring to this mini grid?
John, feel free to turn on your mic and talk to Susanne directly.
I was asking in general.
How people pay for the mini grid? Do you mean
how they pay for the electricity they use? How they know how much they've used and how they pay for it?
Well, there are different payment options, so it depends on the mini grid. Some has like a pay-as-you-go system, so you buy like a token, and then it allows you to a certain amount of electricity. Some have like an invoicing system or a metered system, so you kind of get a bill, based on your monthly use. And some have like a flat fee, so you pay, I don't know, $10 a month or in the local currency, of course, and then you can use as much as you want. So there are various payment models out there. And it's still a big discussion of what are the advantages, because, if you have a metered system, of course, it's better because you can, people are more responsible in their energy use, but then you have higher technical costs. If you have a flat fee, people are not as responsible in their energy use. You don't have the technical costs. But people might also get upset if you have a lot of outages and then they refuse to pay. So it's a big discussion, and it's an essential point how model or which payment model should be implemented. Depends on the community and their buy-in.
And is it all cash based?
It depends. Some is mobile money. It really, it's different from country to country. So Kenya and Uganda has, I would say, it's a gut feeling, have a higher tendency of like mobile money paying. If you look at Zambia, it's a lot of cash money. So someone has to go around and collect, 10 kwacha every week or something like that. So yeah, it's very different from region to region. But a big problem, or not a big problem, but a big issue.
Thank you.
And thank you, John. Yes, in fact, do follow John's lead, ask questions along the way, and Neil has just done the same. Neil, do you want to ask questions while we're doing a mini question round?
Sure. Hi, Susan. You just said that this has been a bit of a white elephant, the Impanta program, and that you couldn't think of a mini grid that runs sustainably. Can you just tell us why mini grids are not sustainable in general? What goes wrong?
Yeah, I'm coming to that.
Okay, brilliant. Okay, in that case, go ahead.
And I said, I don't say there isn't one out there. There is probably, I just haven't heard of it, because there is really limited data available on, the bits and bobs that really matter. So yeah, I just talk to the audience, please. If you have a model that works, let me know, because I'm very interested in it. Okay, but yeah, that's actually a very good question that we shall now see why and what are the challenges. Why isn't it sustainable? First, I just want to talk about what do I understand? What is sustainability and what are the dimensions here? So, we have, broadly speaking, four dimensions here, and I would focus on the financial sustainability, which means, can we finance the operating expenses? I would say it's very optimistic to aim for a mini grid that's fully CapEx sustainable. And I wouldn't promote that yet for various reasons, but I think our minimal goal should be like to have an OpEx sustainable mini grid, which means, the revenue covers all the maintenance and spare parts that, are required throughout the lifespan of the system, and maybe makes a little bit of profit. And then we talk, and connected to that is the technical and operational sustainability. That is not necessarily connected to money, but it's mainly the question, if something breaks or goes wrong, can it be fixed? And who fixes it in what time frame? Of course, we talk about social sustainability, who has access. If you come to these rural communities and suddenly people who already have a bit more money have access to electricity, it might widen gaps or create conflict in these communities. And of course, environmental sustainability, that's a big issue here is the waste question, not only of the components themselves, because most sub-Saharan African countries don't have any recycling or waste management system, but also, the appliances. If you use energy, automatically you have more consumption, you have more products, you have more packaging and things like that. So what happens to that? And there's no solution for that in many rural communities. Just to mention, we see that solar hammer mill here, and when we talk about white elephants, and that's a project it's close to my heart because I met the cooperative who's running it. That's part of a presidential initiative Zambia has installed around 200 of these solar-powered hammer mills, which were, I think, financed by the Chinese and sold to the cooperatives. The only point, they're wonderful systems. They look fabulous when you go there, and you think, wow, what a great installation. And then only point is it's like 12 or 13 kilowatt peak system, or 14, I'm not entirely sure, but in that range. And the solar hammer mill requires around 8 kilowatt of power, which is okay, but it doesn't have a battery backup. So as soon as there's a cloud overcast, the system stops. And I've been there, and it stops like every half an hour to 10 minutes, depending on the season. And the cooperative told me they have to pay like 1,700 kwacha per month as a payback rate to the government, and their revenue is around 600 kwacha. The maintenance is free for the first 3 years, but then they have to pay for it. But they already can't pay for the payback rates. So we know that this might become a white elephant if this is not going to be redesigned. There were a lot of shops close by. You could use the excess energy if you install batteries, for example, but that requires additional investment in a governmental initiative. So that's this system. So that's just one example. And the cooperative was really desperate and said, you know, we don't know what to do and how this is going to be. We are ending up with a big debt. And that's something we want to avoid in the future, of course, and I hope our research will help with that. During Project RISE, we were looking at 3 dimensions, because we were talking mini grids, and a lot of people think maybe technical issues, but that was not so much our focus. And I'm not an engineer, I'm a political scientist. So we were looking at the business side, the community, and the institutional facilitation, and these are interconnected. We performed around 1,800 community surveys in rural Uganda and Zambia. And these were complemented by a lot of stakeholder interviews with institutional stakeholders, with businesses, with donor organizations, and with chiefs. Who play an important role in Zambia on the local level. And I performed various site visits, and we had a lot of focus group discussions with rural communities. So to really get the whole picture. And these stakeholder interviews, they took between an hour to 2.5 hours, and they were really revealing. And it wasn't about, you know, pointing fingers or blaming anyone. It was really about getting a grip on the issue here, because that's what we're trying to find out, you know, what can we do to change the situation. So I start with a community perspective, and I said, you know, it's the most important, because we need to understand the environment where these solutions operate in, and they are decisive. They decide about the size, about the affordability, about, you know, the use of the energy. They decide on everything. So we need to understand that environment. And even if it sounds hard work, and you may ask, okay, but if we have to start at every community, how can we scale it? I mean, yes, that's exactly the question. So, but without this understanding, we don't even have to start, because we might a solution and implement a solution that does not meet the demands and the needs of the potential customers. So out of these 1,800 surveys and our focus group discussions, we generated a few key findings, and some of them were surprising and some of them were like logical. And we compiled them in a big report, and I showed to you at the end how you can access it. This is just a snapshot of what we've been doing. I mean, we had a questionnaire that was like 15 pages long, and our local partners who helped us implementing it said, your questionnaire was great, but it was too long, and I totally agree. And I said, okay, we try to get better. Now they are out there with another long questionnaire. I said, sorry, I failed on that. But it's just demonstrating the complexity of the issue and all things that need to be taken into consideration. A lot of people who might work in this sector have that experience that when you go to African community and you ask them what they need, they say, we need electricity, we want power, we want, you know, to do things with it. And they don't necessarily say we want to watch TV, or, you know, we need it for our, you know, life to have like a better life, but we need to use it to develop and to have more economic opportunities. So there's a widespread array of activities that benefit from electrification, but and there's a high willingness to pay, but it's not the top priority purchase, which makes sense if you have like a drought and there's no food out there. So people would look and invest rather in buying food than, you know, charging their battery, which sometimes, I mean, charging the mobile phone has a top priority, but paying more for a regular access is really not about the willingness, but the ability to pay. So that's why I say it's not a top priority purchase, although there is a great demand, and that needs to be taken into consideration. The second one is productive use has opportunities, and especially cooling and charging devices is a big market for productive use of energy, but there are a lot of challenges, and one is a reality check, I would call it this way. So if you go out to the villages and they ask what would you do, and they answer welding, and welding is really difficult to realize with a mini grid, because, you know, you have a high voltage and you need peak powers levels that you can't really provide with the mini grid. So there are a lot of challenges to unlock this productive use. So there's sometimes this gap between, you know, reality and demand. I don't read out every slide, I hope, if you don't mind, so you can all read that later for yourself. I just give you a snapshot, otherwise we would sit here 3 hours. So it's a lot of information to take in, I know. Third key finding, and really essential when you look at mini grid development, is that there's a very low level of information. Everyone knows something about electricity. They know what solar is. That's a big topic. But hardly anyone has access to proper information of what are the different systems, what are the advantages, and what are the real costs. So there are a lot of like faulty products, you know, because people don't necessarily have access to proper quality products. There are sometimes wrong ideas of what I can do with a solar home system, for example. So depending where you're going, but we found that in rural Zambia, that there's a big lack of information. And you know, one issue is that English is not widely spoken in rural communities, and a lot of developers or sellers of electrical items or solar systems don't speak local language. So there's a big gap between rural and communities and the business side in this part. So we always recommend to work with a local partner if you're going to build a mini grid, because information needs to be transmitted in local language. So we performed all our surveys in local language in Uganda as well as in Zambia, which is a big challenge to translate everything, because sometimes there are not necessarily words for the crazy questions we had. But that's a very important factor to acknowledge this this difference and this specification. On the other hand, if you talk to communities, they are very active, and it's always impressive to understand their view on what they can do with electricity. And you try to find out, because they say we want power, and then you say, okay, what do you want to do with the power? And they come up with a clear plan in many cases, which is fascinating. And they also want to be involved, and unfortunately they are not. So neither on implementation stage of these systems. So a lot of developers rather inform than include the communities when planning systems. So if there are any developers and you do that right, please don't be offended. But that's our feedback we received from the communities. And they are also not represented on national level. So we were talking with the chiefs in Zambia, and they are consulted on a lot of issues on national level, like early child marriages. But they're absolutely not involved in energy questions and energy strategy, which is interesting, because they see themselves as key drivers for development on rural areas, and they have a lot of influence and authority. So talk with and not to the communities. I think that's the takeout we're taking from this finding. Do you have any questions so far? Just looking at you.
Yes, we have a question from Abdul about existing policies and now one from Akibi. I hope I pronounced this right. Do you want to both pose your question at this point? Maybe Abdul first. If Abdul is not there, I can read it out.
Okay, thank you, Philip. Yes, just quickly want to ask about in some of those countries of your studies, did you see any existing policy on de-risking off-grid investment, and what are the what you consider the currency? What are the modalities of incorporating investments in those countries? Because when you look into a previous speaker asked about how did they pay for the energy, and so in looking into that, you imagine how long does it take an investor to recoup such investment, most especially when you are talking about the sustainability, the community ownership. So is there any existing policies of government which can actually de-risk investment of such renewables in those communities?
Well, in terms of policies, there are different approaches. So if you look at Ghana, it was largely a state-run program. I don't know all the details of that program, but it was a largely subsidized program by the government. The problem is for Zambia, for example, the ERB in the new regulatory framework requires cost-reflective tariffs, which poses a risk. And indeed, you mentioned the risk, and that's a big issue. That's why a lot of developers refrain from investing in the off-grid market. At the moment, the main strategy is grant financing between 50 to 70, up to 90 or 100% of the investment costs. And the issue is, I mean, I come from a developer background, and I'm familiar with some installations in Europe. And, you know, I need to be a bit careful here, but when you see sometimes the investment costs of mini grids in Africa, of course, it's higher than in Europe, but sometimes, as we have seen in Panta, they are very high, and, you know, they might not always be 100% justified. So I need to be a bit careful here, and I don't want to assume, you know, that developers are asking for moon prices, but sometimes, you know, the price structure is a bit questionable. So to go back to your question, in many countries, you don't necessarily have this mitigation from the government side. It's often taken over from international donors who might calculate a certain default degree of default. And yeah, and to be honest, I don't know. I don't know what these mini grids are doing after 10 years, whether they're just written off because, you know, the grant financing is used, or whether it's taken over. So if you look at the Mpanta grid, it's run by the Renewable Electrification Authority, and they finance the OPEX gap. So it varies, and sometimes they just become abandoned. So just these systems then just don't operate anymore. There are some promising developments lately, but it's too early to say how they are doing in terms of sustainability. So I was looking at earlier investments, because you can really only say after 3 to 5 years, you know, when the first maintenance issues occur, how sustainable the mini grid is.
Fantastic. Well, really good question. I'm mindful of time, but we've got another question from Zahem, which actually was on my mind as well, about the differences in demand. Do you want to turn on your camera and your mic and ask a question? Please turn your cameras on as well so we can see you.
Okay, so I'm on my phone, so it's not so clear. I'm going to be bouncing around. So I was really just musing out loud about the comment the doctor made around the demand and what people would be prioritizing energy for. So in West Africa, for instance, in Nigeria, where, you know, energy is pretty much high priority, and the demand is mostly for commercial purposes, for business purposes, but also for residential. There's a growing middle class with an appetite for middle class amenities like washing machines and dishwashers and all that kind of stuff. So I can imagine that I can see that your study was mostly like in Zambia. You also mentioned Ghana, but I think I would imagine that if you went to Nigeria as well and other places, you would see that the energy demand would be different.
Yes,
And then that might influence, the pricing strategies and how quickly you're able to recover the capex and then the opex.
Exactly. That's a very good point. And that's why I say you need to look at the community. So there is no one solution fits all. And in West Africa, where you have a higher socioeconomic development in certain areas, you might have a better chance to recover these. I didn't find one yet there as well, to be honest, but it's not my main focus of research. So I don't say it's not out there.
Okay.
I only know what I don't know.
All right.
But yes, that's right. And we see, that's interesting. We had a few surveys done among mini-grid users. So you can see that on the slide that's out there now. And you see slightly different demands for energy use among mini-grid users. So we found some differences. So what's interesting here, for example, that you see they apparently have more appliances already running. And then they, for example, want to operate an iron because they already have business. They need to be dressed nicely, and because an iron would be probably not your primary, demand when you don't have any appliances. So we see a shift here, and yeah, and I totally agree. But that's when you plan a mini grid, and then you also need to plan for stage 2, because if you manage to run and utilize the energy, then you achieve. You reach a demand side that needs to be enhanced, or the supply side needs to be enhanced because the demand is growing. So you idly get there, and then you have a stage 2 for the mini grid. So you rather start smaller, and when you see it's working, then you can expand. But it doesn't make sense, for example, in the Mpanta mini grid, it was way too big for the community, and then they had to switch off, and instead of 60 kilowatt, they now have 45 kilowatt, also because of technical errors. But they could never utilize the power properly, for example. Yes, and that's why I say we need to look at the demand side. We don't have a solution, we put there and then see what happens, but you need to get a grip on the demand side and understand what your consumers are and what they need, or who they are, sorry, and what they need.
All right, thank you.
Brilliant, fascinating. Yes, and I agree. It's a very interesting area, how demand develops as you electrify. We've got another good question here from Jan, actually quite a challenging one. Jan, do you want to ask about China and Western donors?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, my question is, do you see any difference between the typical Western donors, funders, and developers versus the Chinese who have recently made inroads into Africa in the infrastructure sphere?
Mm-hmm. Well, I can only talk about my experience from Zambia again, and I'm sorry for that limited perspective. And what I found there is that the Chinese investors mainly go through the government as they are like agents of distribution. So we have seen that, for example, with the solar hammer mill presented earlier, and they also had like a television school program, while the Western donors almost exclusively go through private developers and private companies through tenders. They might partner with the government and their agency, but in the end, the implementation is done through tenders and then by private sector developers.
Excellent. Suzanne, how do you want to play it? Do you want to go to the end of the slides? There's another question from Tim. I just wonder, shall we leave questions for the end, or do you want to keep answering questions?
I'm happy to take them as they come in.
Yeah. Okay. How much more have you got in terms of slides?
Well, no, sorry, I don't want to touch my screen. I think I have 10, 12 more.
Yeah.
Yeah, we have more than an hour left, right? So.
Fantastic. Well, Tim, do you want to come on and ask your question?
Hi there. I had a couple of sort of weather-related questions. The first one was, the first one actually was just about nighttime. I mean, I guess these power units would come with some kind of battery storage or something like that for nighttime. But then I was thinking about the, countries that have prolonged rainy seasons. And I was slightly worried that, if somebody got to be dependent on these electricity supplies, then what would happen during the rainy seasons when the electricity production would be much less? And then just if I could just ask the second question, which is sort of vaguely related. Have you given any thought to the use of solar power to power air conditioning units on the basis that if you believe the climate models, they're going to be increasingly frequent periods where there'll be quite excessive heat stress in parts of the tropics and subtropics, and this could be a sort of solution to that problem. So they're two rather separate questions, I'm afraid.
Okay. Yes, to come to the first question, I'm not an engineer for my defense, so please. But yes, most of the systems are battery powered, and actually the battery system is the most expensive part of the whole system, whether you use the LED or the lithium-ion battery. So, and they require a lot of maintenance. So that's a very sensitive part. So you need to balance the system correctly. And we're working with the University of Rome and the University of Zambia with the Department of Physics and the engineering department. So they're working on these optimization models of batteries to have the optimal like cost and system functioning balance here. But that is definitely a big topic. To come with the overcast system, yes, you have the rainy seasons, but you calculate that because you have pretty good data on annual irradiation levels. And even, you know, when there's overcast, the sun is pretty intense. So it might affect some countries with like heavy rainy season where it's really cloudy the whole day differently. So you need to take that into consideration when you dimension your system, which means it probably gets a bit more expensive because you might need to install more capacity in order to charge a battery. But that, again, is a technical planning question, which you need to balance, again, with the cost and the revenue when you have your system. But the cooling, yes, that is a big problem. Cooling is also one of the most important aspects mentioned by the respondents. In terms of air conditioning, we have the issue here that they are very energy intensive. And it depends on what kind of model you run. So if you want to have a cost reflective model, the energy, it gets very expensive. So I'm not sure about the detailed consumption values. And now there are also some low energy options available, I suppose. But in general, these are very expensive to run. So you really need to see then how can you pay for the electricity. And that's unless you donor fund it, but then you also need to fund the OPEX. You need to have a long-term funding model for that. So that's one that's a very critical issue.
We also had a very neat suggestion from Roberta about diversifying your portfolio. So if you have a wet season, you might use hydro as well, so you can hedge between the two.
You have a river, yeah. But you need a river or something.
Yes.
Yeah. Might be, and I'm talking. That's maybe I'm talking about solar here because it's widespread and you don't have a lot of local requirements. You can almost put it everywhere. So this is a very, brave statement here, but you can basically almost put it everywhere. Whereas with hydro, you're limited. You need a stream with a certain flow, and it's quite an intense upfront investment, and it's rather larger system. So you also must make sure you have the demand on the other side. Because you don't build like a 10 kilowatt mini hydro. I'm not sure the investment is very high, but someone else might argue that
happens at a slightly higher level of investment indeed. And we've also had a question from Pascal. So the questions keep flooding in. So thanks so much. Love it. So yeah, we'll probably run slightly past 5 o'clock, I can foresee. So Pascal was very curious about any technical issues that you might have run into with the solar panels on microgrids.
Yes, we were asking people who were using mini grids, and we were also asking developers. So one common problem were lightning strikes. So it depends, where it's located, if it's on a mountain or you have an area. So a lot of lightning strike problems. And in terms of the installation end user, we had fires and people got electrical shocks, but it's not always clear whether it was due to the installation or maybe they tried to tweak the system. But it was not an overall problem, so we had a few responses, but it wasn't like major sticking out.
Can I ask a follow-up to this? So do you think all the products that are available on the market are actually suitable, or is there like some, really the technical products, there's some gap there? I'm curious about myself.
Which technical, the appliances or the system components?
Well, on the system components, yeah, not the appliances.
Yeah, it's like if you buy something, you only know afterwards. So it's not, it really depends on the region, and unfortunately you also have a lot of black sheep out there, and you have a lot of faulty appliances in circulation. And here again we go to the consumer who doesn't have the knowledge and they don't know about warranty and stuff. So you know, that doesn't make it easier. So it's not all perfect, of course not.
Thank you.
Okay, let me quickly continue the presentation. Thank you for that question, because we still have a few areas to cover. So I will go a bit faster, and then you can email me afterwards if you have any specific comments, and this will also be available, I think, online. So these are a few areas that you need to cover when you do an assessment for the mini grid. As I said, you need to understand the environment you're operating in, and it unfortunately generates a lot of work to collect this information. Biggest challenge, and we were talking about payment. So here we had the simple question, does their income change a lot? And almost everyone said yes, because, and that's not only Zambia, that's in a lot of African countries who have seasonal rainfalls. During the dry season, a lot of people who are small scale farmers don't have any income. So what do you do with your mini grid during that time? And on the other hand, we also see the spending levels. So most of the people spend around 500 kwacha a month, which is, I would say, 40 euros. So, you know, if you only spend or earn 40 euros, so this was equally, so spending and income was almost equal. You know, you also need to be able to pay for the electricity, and how do you pay that extra? Because people usually don't have money left over at the moment. So these are the critical issues. So it's low income and it's intermittent income. That is a big constraint for mini grids and sustainable operation. So we have all these challenges now of the community that you need to understand, and they are interrelated, and they are all aggravated by climate change. So the situation doesn't even get better. So I won't go into detail, but it's just to get that picture, to understand what the communities are dealing with, and they're still happy and say, hey, we want to go further and have a chance. So, but these need to be taken into consideration when you develop a mini grid. What does this mean now for the business model? We all know productive use has the potential of income generation, and there's a lot of data and research on that. And we also know what they want. It's cooling, it's hairdressing, it's restaurants. So it's a lot of diverse areas. They slightly differ. And when you go out and you develop a mini grid, you look which businesses are there and how can we scale their business. You wouldn't necessarily start with something new. But the question is, how do we get this to the market? And, you know, how do we transfer this into like the untapped potential into a tapped potential? And, you know, we have all these barriers for the sustainable operation. And, you know, it's economic, it's the cost, it's like also the management. And what we see a lot is that, you know, you don't have a model for the long-term operation and the maintenance and to cover, you know, any additional components that need to be exchanged. And you also have the social and cultural barriers. So it's a big change. And if you operate that, you need the whole community behind it. And the user needs to be adapted because it's a new technology. So these all need to be taken into account. And again, you cannot do that top down. These are some economic recommendations. I won't go through it in detail because, yeah, time is limited. But yeah, main point is if you have the CapEx funded, and that's in like 90% of the mini grid projects, you have at least 70 or 50% grant funding there. You need to have an OPEX model, and you need to have a realistic calculation. And when I looked at some of the calculations, and most of them didn't include any exchange of components. So if, you know, an inverter breaks after 5 years or 7 years and there's no money to replace it, the whole system is down and you run into big trouble. So that needs to be taken care of. And it's not only about having the revenue and saving the money, but also organizing the collection and the savement. So again, it's all the operation side that needs a lot of attention here. And what do we do with all this information? And that's where we are now with the project Mumuni Singani. Is we're like ambitious and we say, okay, we try to tackle all these all these challenges and turn a mini grid project into like an infrastructure project. So we don't only look at energy. Energy is one part of the solution, but we also look at all the other factors. So, you know, we are dealing with this area with a lot of drought, and small-scale farmers and vegetable garden owners who don't have income. So we need to provide some kind of irrigation and rainwater harvesting to allow them to grow their vegetables all year long. We need to make appliances accessible. You know, if you have the power and you can't buy your egg incubator somewhere, what does the power help you? So we need to have sustainable farming. At the moment, it's largely maize they grow, but it's not a very sustainable crop because it needs a lot of water and fertilizer. We're partnering up with Mobile Power, who provide mobile power solutions, small batteries that are charged at the mini grid and then spread out to households that can't be connected in order to, you know, get a bit of a stable revenue and the utilization of the energy. So this is our multi-partner approach. So it's not research anymore, like RISE was almost 100% research and academic focus. We're now partnering with the private sector and with the non-governmental organizations to get a grip on the issue and develop a concept, which then can be implemented. So this is the business model that we are working here for this specific location. So we're having certain tiers of consumer groups. That's nothing new. That's not, you know, that's a lot of mini grid developers do it. We'll include schools and we're including a health center, but we're very detailed assessing now what kind of appliances do they have, how much energy do they want, do they need, and what can they afford at the moment. And if they want more energy or they want to increase their business, we also need a model for that. So, and we need to provide for that. And we're working with women self-help groups who collect money and they lend money to each other, and they're like economic drivers in these communities. And it's very promising for us in terms of operation to include these women and to also potentially train them in supporting the operation, because they are a very stabilizing factor in these communities. We're also looking into irrigation. So I found myself in measuring the school roofs that we have on the site and calculate how much water we can harvest. What is the cheapest solution in order to provide some kind of irrigation? I'm not talking drinking water here. I'm just talking about irrigation through rainwater harvesting, because they have such a big drought there. You can't drill boreholes because the groundwater levels are so low. We're also including reforestation with Plant a Million Zambia and clean cooking solutions. So it's a holistic approach. It's complex, but it's a holistic approach focused on the demand side. And the main question is, how can we enable people to pay for their electricity? So that's like the baseline question of the whole concept. This is a bit of the detail. How does it work? This is an example of the egg incubator. And we're currently working out these details with the community members, like how much energy do you need to incubate how many eggs, and what is the added value on that? Where do you sell these eggs? It's nice if you then suddenly have 10 more chicken per month, but where do you sell them and who pays for it? So it's a bit like there's a hole in the bucket song, you know, because you tackle one issue and then you come to the next and the next and the next. How do you transport the goods to the next market and all these things? But that makes it interesting and exciting, but also very, very complex. Any questions to this specific concept?
We do have questions. I thought we'll now save them for Q&A
Okay.
at the end.
Good. I thought there's something specific regarding the concept. So, okay. Of course, this is an idea at the moment, and you know, I'm very realistic. I've worked in the private sector, so I don't want to do any, you know, wishful thinking here. So we identify some strengths and weaknesses, of course, and you know, the main question is the scalability. So we found it's a lot of work to put in to this pilot concept, and that might be an argument from those of you who are working in the private sector and involved in mini grid development. The goal is also to standardize some processes here and to say, okay, you need to go to this and this and this person. Here's a questionnaire, and this is a model for income generation added value. But you need to collect the data on site. You still have to. So we're trying to reflect on the model and anticipate any issues. And then I hope, you know, if we are successful with our future proposal applications, that we can demonstrate that that's going to work. Just a brief look at the policy side. So what now for the policymakers? We found there are a lot of strategic gaps in Uganda and Zambia, so there's no real coherence. Rural electrification has been largely outsourced to the private sector. But there's a lot of noise in the market, but there's no clear strategy. And then there's also some grid expansion going on, which is not necessarily aligned with off-grid, which creates a legal risk, you know, for mini grid developers to say, what happens if your grid arrived? Energy tariffs might be subsidized in the on-grid sector, and you have to work on a cost-reflective basis. And we have that case in Zambia right now, where one mini grid is really struggling because the mini grid, the grid, national grid arrived, and people say, oh, I want to pay, you know, 5 cents instead of 15 for the electricity. These are fictional prices, but that's a real issue, and it has not been solved. And we also need to be clear on monitoring and evaluation. And it's not about pointing fingers, but learning from the projects that have been implemented and provide more clear data and avoid moon pricing. Because only then we can have an operational sustainability. And I think financing approaches need to be revised. At the moment, they're very CapEx driven. So there need to be like an incentive for operating the mini grid for more than 2 or 3 years. So there needs to be a shift in the financing paradigm. And that needs to be developed with developers or with the private sector, with the donors, but also with the communities together. So I skip this as the opportunity. So this is my top 10 of the rural electrification. And yeah, again, I want to put my focus on the operations, on the demand side and the affordability, and also on the role women can play in these processes, because I think they are largely overlooked yet. And we have some wonderful initiatives of organized women groups in some communities, and they should be more incorporated in these developments because they can be a stabilizing factor for mini grid operation. So I have some of the publications here that we recently published from the project, but also from other academics, some very interesting articles, mainly focused on operational issues of mini grids. I have the project websites here where you find more information. And I can also recommend our practitioners report from Project RISE, which is available online on the project website of Project RISE. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Suzanne. And yeah, that was amazing. And you've even skipped over the opportunity. So there might be more that we want to dig into in the questions. And there have been questions all the way through, which is wonderful. So really stimulating talk. The first one I parked for Q&As is from Andrew. Andrew, great to have you with us. Do you want to turn your camera on and ask Suzanne directly?
Yes, thank you very much, Phil, and Suzanne. Thanks indeed for your presentation. I'm afraid I missed the first few minutes of it, but I don't think you covered this during that. So I hope I'm not going over old ground. Basically, I am involved, have been for about 4 years in Uganda, through a role on the board of the distribution company there. But I have a colleague who is heavily involved in development of mini grids, microgrids, and from discussions with him, as well as from some of our own research, we have found that while there's generally tremendous enthusiasm from potential customers when a potential mini grid goes into a new area, in many cases, the demand forecasts or projections that one hopes to get to don't actually get reached, because the reality is that while the electrons may be affordable, the pieces of kit to use the electrons are not. And so one of the things we've been working with a couple of external providers on is looking at the potential for financing for those appliances. And I wondered if that's something that you have highlighted. I think there was a reference to it in one of your earlier slides, but I'm wondering if there's some data or feedback which you had that would give any credence to that. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, Andrew. That's a very good point. And as I mentioned earlier, the willingness to pay and the affordability are two different sides of a coin. And we have this gap between reality and projected demand a lot. We're looking at this appliance problem, and we are very well aware of that. In the project at the moment, we're mainly focusing on egg incubators and fridges, and we're looking into a model that we might have a rent-to-own scheme. So we do not charge for the electricity, but we charge for like a running fridge or a running incubator in cooperation with either the Women's Self-Help Group or the local cooperative. So this is at a development stage, and I said we currently collect data to get more understanding of what size of appliances we need, but that's clearly something that needs to be addressed because the access to appliances and good quality and low energy consumption appliances is a big issue. So we incorporate that in the project, and we start with very selected appliances, and the needs might differ from community to community. So this is based on the feedback we got from the community. So they mainly said we need egg incubators and fridges. And we now try to develop a business case out of it and say, as I mentioned earlier, how many more chicken can you get out of that, and how do you sell them, and what's the return on investment here? The same with the fridge, because the shop owner said we want the fridge for cooling a Coke, but would a customer pay more for a chilled Coke than a non-chilled Coke, for example? So we're looking into these issues.
That's great. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you, Andrew. And so we've got questions still flooding in. So we've got a whole Nick Jelly, first of all, himself an inventor of a solar cooker, and he's asking about respiratory issues. Nick, do you want to?
Suzanne, thanks very much for your talk. Very interesting indeed. It really follows on from the previous question in a way. You mentioned respiratory illnesses is the big killer, and electrification of cooking may be the answer. Induction cookers are coming down in cost. Has there been any suggestion that rental of induction cookers might be a way to avoid respiratory illnesses?
You know,
a new way of cooking. I know the problem.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, that's a very big question. And as you see, clean cooking is part of our concept. Here again, we have a context problem. Inductive cookers are an interesting appliance, still very high in energy demand. So you need to look at the affordability and willingness to pay question here, because it is still quite expensive to run them. Additional issue is that the famous food in rural Zambia is called nshima, which is like a maize porridge that you cook for hours, which is very hard to run on an induction cooker. So we are not there yet in terms of this question, to be honest, in Zambia at that stage. It might come, as we heard earlier, that if you have in socio-economic growth and development, that you reach a stage where people move to that. But as long as they can collect firewood and charcoal for free, it's very hard to promote these appliances, which are rather expensive. But in the future, I would say definitely an option. But it also needs to be flanked by a change in food habits.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. And next we've got Neil. Now you've really hit a nerve with Neil. Neil doesn't have one or two questions. He's got three. Neil, welcome back.
I'm sorry, but it's such a fantastic talk, Susan. So you've got me going. Two economic questions and one political one. Mm-hmm. First of all, there's a famous paper by Lee Miguel and Wolfram about grid connectivity, which rather dampened enthusiasm for connections to the grid by pointing out that there was simply no pricing model, at least in Kenya, whereby the consumer surplus came anywhere close to the amounts that were being paid. So in other words, it simply wasn't worth it to connect people. Is there any evidence that you're aware of that the significant investments that are going into this kind of thing, all of the community facilitation and thinking through all of the problems and the modeling and then all of the technical challenges and so forth, are actually delivering outcomes that are bigger than what it costs? Because if not, then if one was a nasty economist, you might say this isn't worth it. Second point on the thing, I hope the answer to that is it is worth it. I certainly think morally it is. if the answer to that is worth it, what is effective and realistic model for subsidizing it? This is a huge problem. We know that many communities, particularly the poorest communities, never really going to be able to pay for the full costs. I mean, even if they'll be able to pay for the OPEX, that'll be great. So what are realistic models for subsidizing it? And then thirdly, just from a practical point of view, electricity always gets politicized. The grid is very politicized and lots of corruption in grid procurement projects. Is there political capture of mini-grid projects? Have you observed that happening? Do you get politicians wandering around at election time saying, I'm going to give you a mini-grid, but don't you worry, you'll just have to pay the national tariff? Have you seen problems of that nature, and how might they be dealt with?
Mm-hmm. Okay. Thank you, Neil. Yeah, well, complex questions, I must say. To answer the first one, I mean, you are right. I mean, we never know about the payback, but we can also give up. So, and I don't give up. I think if we look at the past, and that also relates to your second question, if we look at the past, how electrification happened, in the US and Europe and other so-called Western countries, it was never fully cost reflective at the beginning, and there was always some kind of subsidy involved because no consumer could ever afford buying or financing his own grid connection. So for the communities, we need to look at the long perspective. And I was looking at the SDGs and how they are connected. And, it's also our responsibility because we created climate change, and these communities are now suffering from climate change. And I've seen it, and it's incredible. People have food shortages, and no water. And we have to do something. So it's a moral responsibility, but it's also, in my view, a sustainable responsibility, because it's not donations. It's like giving people a chance to reach the next level in socioeconomic development. It has a great impact for us as well. So I think it's always a question, economic cost, how do you calculate this in the long term? So I hope that was the response that you wanted to hear, but that's my strong opinion, that there's simply no alternative, and we cannot accept the situation as it stands. The second one, and that's connected to that, the realistic model for subsidy. I mean, my personal opinion is we can't have like fully cost reflective mini grids in the near future, OPEX and CAPEX wise. We need to shift the model, the CAPEX focused model, in my view. So we have these 70-80% of grant financing, but we need to come to like a support of the operation costs to incentivize longer term operations, and maybe have smaller systems that are more viable in the long term. So there needs to be a shift, and that's again the details that need to be figured out. And I'm currently trying to crunch the numbers with our Zambian partners from the university to see what would make sense, maybe also to have like an incentive for the first 3 years, for example, to break the glass ceiling and allow people to obtain the energy at a cheaper subsidized price. Unfortunately, for example, in Zambia, the regulatory framework doesn't allow that because they require cost reflective tariffs, which also limits, our kind of creative approaches of rent to own models of running appliances a bit. So we're trying to check that out at the moment. So there needs to be a more open discussion, and there needs to be a shift in the paradigm of how it's been done at the moment. So I hope that answers your question in terms of what's realistic. The second one, political interference with grid procurement. Well, if you see the situation in Zambia and Uganda, mini off-grid electrification has largely been outsourced to the private sector and is very donor-driven. So I didn't come across that in my personal experience. What you see are difficulties sometimes, in licensing processes. So we got a very mixed response from businesses. Some businesses from Uganda said, it takes us ages and it was horrible. Others said it was very smooth and easy. So we get a very mixed picture on that. We don't see a lot of political interference because, for example, in Zambia, although rural electrification is a big political priority on display, the actual measures are relatively minimal because also, there's a lack of investment capital on the government side. So yeah, I didn't come across, it might be a bit of a different picture in Ghana. So I read some differing reports there because it was a government-driven initiative. So I think there was some interference, but I'm not sure to which degree. So that's not, my special area. So, but it might be worth looking into that direction. But if you have a off-grid electrification that's mainly run by private sector, it's rather limited, I would say.
Very good. Yeah, I think these are really weighty questions we're pondering here, and the common good value of grids in general, I think, is very interesting, how we justify paying for them. And a question that goes in that direction as well, I think, is from my colleague Alicia.
Hi, yes, thank you for the talk. It was really interesting. Similar examples in Kenya, and I hope that my internet is still on. Anyway.
Sorry, could you repeat? I think you were gone for a few seconds.
Yeah, I'll turn my camera off so I can continue talking, and hopefully it doesn't cut again. Yeah, so I've heard of similar examples of grid lines eventually reaching mini grid locations in Kenya and other countries. And I find that really difficult to stomach in terms of existing infrastructure becoming redundant. It just feels wasteful as an engineer, but economically, does it make more sense for, say, a public utility to purchase existing private mini grids and then subsidize the tariffs so that they can be at that national tariff rate? Or does it make more sense to extend the grid and just let that mini grid infrastructure kind of sit there? I'm interested in the economic perspective because, yeah, my heart says don't let the mini grid die, but I don't know the economics.
Yes, absolutely. No, Alicia, that's a very good point. I mean, the major cause of the problem, and I mentioned it briefly when we were here at the policy level, is that off-grid and on-grid development is often not aligned, because on-grid infrastructure is in the hands of, state utilities, or it has some government involvement, and off-grid electrification is purely private. And yeah, let the mini grid die. I mean, someone runs and owns the mini grid, and he needs to be paid. So in Zambia, they try to tackle the problem, but I think the regulatory framework is not still very clear, because if that happens, you kind of need to negotiate with a state utility. And if you can't reach an agreement, the State Energy Regulation Board has the final say. So developers are not entirely happy with that regulation. The problem is, if you say, shall we just take it over and feed the energy in? Well, it might stabilize the national grid. So especially, Zambia has a few centralized feed-in points in the on-grid sector. So it might be good for the grid stabilization to have more decentralized feed-in points. Again, I'm not an engineer and I'm not in on-grid planning, but the problem is that energy generation from the mini grid is usually more expensive. And then in addition to that, the tariffs are subsidized in the national grid. Of course, the money must come from somewhere, but if it's a different pot, then there might be a problem, and a very low willingness of the utility to incorporate the mini grid and have the burden of the running cost, especially if the mini grid is not fully operationally sustainable, or if they just pay off the developer and leave it as a stranded asset and take in the customers. I mean, generally utilities are very interested, because when there's a mini grid, suddenly there's demand. And in some regions, as I said, there is, although the mini grid's not sustainable, you still have that demand and you have potential customers. So it is an unresolved problem, and you can't really say this or that is the better option. It really depends on the case.
Great, thank you.
Right, and we've got one last question from Abir, and then we'll wrap up. Come on, Abir.
Yes, hi. Just a quick question. It's basically, you mentioned obviously the issue of cooking and the pollution and indoor pollution and all that. And I know there's a lot of options for indoor, for alternative cookers, but what about solar cookers? Are they a viable option? Are they something that you would consider? So how do they look for as an option?
Well, okay, thank you, Rita. Well, there are a lot of innovative ideas coming up. I only know the solar bakers. I don't really know the real solar cookers. I know I've seen solar bread ovens. Again, the problem is here you need to look at what the people eat. And if they eat the Nishima, which needs 3 hours of full cooking on full power, then a solar cooker has a very limited use. It might be usable if you have other appliances, but I'm not very familiar with the technical how can I say, applicability of these cookers for, you know, the food the people eat. Let's put it this way, because you need to bring together the solution and the consumer need.
Okay, thank you.
Fantastic. And this is probably exactly the sort of insight that you have because you're actually on the ground visiting these communities, talking to them. So some of us sometimes get accused of slightly sitting in our ivory towers in research and sort of pontificating about what emerging economies should do, and you've really been right there. So this is fascinating. I think the audience response captures how excited we are about your work, and I hope it can continue and be funded. That's always a challenge, I presume, in this area, to keep this work funded.
Yes.
Important as it is, I hope that can continue. So that leaves me to say thank you so much, Suzanne, and everyone else. Thank you for joining us again this week. Please come back next week. We're going to have Tim Schwanen, also from the School of Geography. He's the director of the Transport Studies Unit, and he will talk to us about towards just transitions towards low carbon mobility, something he's a genuine expert on. I was literally just on the Today program to talk about it, so we're going to get a slightly more expanded version from him to learn about his work. So once again, thank you all very much, and I hope to see you next week.